Big Brother is watching in China. Millions of people are being punished for what's considered bad behavior under a government monitoring scheme. Is this ethical, and could it be taking surveillance too far? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Whether we like it or not, we are constantly being watched. Security cameras and smartphones are making it easier to monitor our lives. China's government wants to take this further by eventually rating everyone on their conduct. So-called social credit trials are underway in several cities, and people accused of bad behavior are being penalized. The government said that last year, more than 17 million people with low scores were barred from buying plane tickets, and another 5 million weren't allowed on high-speed trains. 4 million companies have been blacklisted for what it called untrustworthy conduct, including defrauding customers. Rights activists have raised privacy concerns. So what is social credit and how does it work? It is a monitoring system that ranks businesses and citizens on their behavior. The Chinese government says it aims to reinforce integrity in government affairs, businesses and society. Scores can go up and down. Points are removed for bad behavior such as defaulting on loans, taxes, selling faulty products or violating traffic laws. Bad citizens are punished, but those who behave well are given rewards such as cheaper bank loans, free heating and water services. Regulatory bodies collect data from courts, government agencies, neighbors or professional records. The pilot scheme started almost 4 years ago. The government hopes the program will be nationwide and mandatory by 2020. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Wang, China analyst at the Economist intelligence unit. In Singapore, via Skype, is Zennon Kapron, chief executive of KapronAsia, which analyzes technology trends in China, and in London, Anna Bacchiarelli, a technology researcher and advisor at Amnesty International. Welcome to you all. Dan, I would like to ask you this because there's been some debate, some confusion about the whole score mechanism and the social credits system. People saying that China has been mischaracterized by the international media. Could you just explain to us, is this purely similar to the credits check that we see in the West, or there is more to this story?
Well, to me, I think there is a shocking side of this, and there is a good reason to be afraid of how big this scale can go to. But to me, given that we could take it from a sinister point of view or assume that Chinese government is out of good intention, I tend to want to believe that Chinese government is doing this still out of good intention, because China's legislation and judiciary system is far from being perfect. So there's a lot of room to be improved. And given that Chinese economy is growing so fast in the past 40 years, and it's very difficult to find an effective way to monitor and do law enforcement. And in many places, especially in the rural area, the law enforcement is basically missing. So I think Chinese government is basically finding this way to be the simplest and most effective way to them to quickly punish those that should be punished.
Zennon, let's assume that the government is acting in good faith. How would this be good for the Chinese people?
Well, I think in general, when you're dealing with such a huge population, as was mentioned, it's very difficult to enforce justice, to ensure that people are getting the right access to capital through loans that they need. So a system like this enables the government to have a very quantitative approach to social credit. So figuring out who is the right person that should be accessing that loan and who is necessarily the bad person. I think we've seen lots of bad actors. Something that comes to mind is e-commerce. Originally, when Taobao and Tmall first launched in China, there were a lot of fake products, and still there are today. So if there was a consistent way to rate and regulate both businesses and individuals, it would really help society in general, because it would take away a lot of those fears. There's been lots of challenges around milk formula and fake products in the past. Imagine if the average Chinese consumer could get their food knowing that it was real and it was not a fake product.
Anna, this boils down to a simple thing, which is basically the government is putting into place a monitoring system that will closely monitor your behavior, be it a company or an individual. Is this something that falls within the rules of international law?
Thank you. Absolutely not. Let's be clear that this system is situated in China, which we already know is violating human rights at a mass scale. For example, the cybersecurity law brought in a couple of years ago just solidifies mass violations of freedom of expression, of the right to privacy, and as a result, we're seeing lawyers, teachers, human rights activists locked up simply for defending human rights. I think that a big data system that is based in such a jurisdiction just simply cannot be seen to be compliant with human rights.
Dan, I mean, let's go back to the idea of ranking people's trustworthiness. I mean, from an ethical perspective, why do you give yourself the right to decide what people should do? How do they behave when, well, this is China ultimately by the end of the day, but individual freedoms are enshrined. This has become universal.
Well, I can see the controversial point here, but there is also a point that when there are real victims in a society, how do you protect them? Because, for example, we see a lot of victims from the peer-to-peer lending, and the Chinese law and legislation to this area is absolutely very weak to protect any of those victims. So what we can see is that by establishing this system, it can have some deterrence impact on those people, and I can see that being positive. But you're right, it's very hard to decide where the line should be drawn, because it is fundamentally the government that will choose the criteria, and we don't know what criteria should be chosen and how they will be enforced. And behind those criteria, we don't really have a specific name or face that is held accountable to it. And then eventually the question becomes, we don't know when the bad outcome will happen. It might be the very people that need help that fundamentally, eventually, they can get hurt.
Mr. Kapron, I mean, people have in the back burner of their memory the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square events. This is a society notoriously known for not being transparent or democratic. Why would people now give credit to the government that is willing to put into place a formidable transparency system?
Well, I don't think transparency was ever meant to be part of the social credit system. I mean, regardless of whether the system is going to be used for good or bad, for monitoring individuals, as we're seeing in the west of China right now in the Xinjiang region, or if it's being used to decide who gets loans. I think one thing that's 100% clear is that the metrics and the system that's going to be used is not going to be transparent. And I think to probably very few companies out there. I think we've seen that in general in China. As I was living in Shanghai, the number of street cameras that are going up, and you don't really know where that information is going or what it's being used for. They're just there, and every day there's new methods of surveillance. So you do kind of hope that it's being used for the right things, but it's very unclear about what they are collecting, what's being done with that data, and what it's going to be used for.
Anna, the government says this is purely to boost the administrative efficiency, to encourage trust, and at the same time to bring back trust to the product quality in a place where this has been a real issue for decades.
With respect, I don't think that is necessarily the case. We know that the state authorities are persecuting the Uyghur and Han populations in the Xinjiang region, for example. We know that there are mass indiscriminate human rights abuses taking place across China, and that is being fueled by big data and by new technology. And we've really got to be careful about rolling out new technologies that involve machine learning, that involve big data, and the operations in Xinjiang are a prime case of why we should not trust the government when it comes to this social credit system.
Dan, I mean, if the government was really willing to put into place a system that respects human rights and ethical consideration, well, speaking of ethical consideration, you're a country known for destroying natural resources across the continent. Human rights considerations don't come really as a top priority issue in places. We've seen that in many places. And suddenly you're saying that every single individual in China, in Beijing, across the country who wants to buy diapers, who wants to watch a video game, is suddenly being monitored by the government, which will ultimately decide whether he's a good person or a bad person. This looks really bizarre I think, for the whole world.
Right. When I first heard how many people are already affected by the system and how many people are on the blacklist, I was quite shocked. It doesn't make me comfortable to see the system being established. However, that being said, I do think several years or several decades down the road, using smart technology to monitor society is going to be the big trend. The problem with China is that its government doesn't have a stellar record to keep privacy of its citizens, and it doesn't have a very good record in humanitarian behaviors. So for the government like this to enact such a system, there is widely distrust among the public. However, to govern such a large country, and also as almost a partial response to the U.S. call to do structural reform in China, there has to be certain preconditions. In an ideal world, China should establish this market economy, and it should introduce all sorts of free market rules, open economy, all sorts of things. But it cannot just happen overnight by just introducing those rules. There has to be compatible law enforcement environment. There has to be social trust, which China do not have much right now. If you walk in China, it's not the most trusting society in the world for sure. Strangers rarely help each other. If you stay here long enough, you will see internet fraud. There will be some sort of scam that you will experience. And it's really hard to control with the current policing and the government.
Mr. Kapron, it seems that we are in a new era. And there are two things here, just for our audience, which is basically there is businesses operating in China which have their own data about their clients and which they are using. It's parallel with the social credit system, which is going to be monitored by the government. But eventually, I think both will converge. The moment they converge, will it give more power to the government to take over all the data from the private sector?
It's very unclear, even at this point, how much access the government has into private data. I mean, if you look at any of the big companies, the big tech companies right now in China, like Ahelbarra or Tencent, there are public security officers that sit within the company to monitor what's happening at those companies. So one would presume that the government already has some sort of access, or at least could have access into private individuals' database. I think what's interesting about this is if you look at GDPR in Europe, which is a far-reaching privacy regulation that was enacted early last year, China has its own version of this data security for individuals in China. And it's actually, in certain respects, even more strict than GDPR. But how, again, it comes back to the idea of how the government is using the technology and using that data. And that's, where the belief is in terms of if it's for the good or if it's for the bad will really determine how comfortable people feel about what the government is doing.
Anna, I've seen many views from China saying basically this is unfair because if human rights agencies and organizations like yours are talking about Orwellian mass surveillance, they should also be talking about or singling out the West in particular. In America, you have companies that have access to our own private data, and they are known for selling that data to other companies, compromising the safety, the privacy of billions of people across the globe. Why aren't they targeted?
Well, indeed, Amnesty International does condemn human rights violations by tech companies, by governments around the world. We certainly don't single out China. And we call on the big tech companies in the US, for example, to do their human rights due diligence, as they have human rights responsibilities separate from the state, and they are required to really assess the risk of their technology and human rights, to take measures to mitigate or prevent any risks to rights, and then to remedy those rights, to make amends where human rights will be harmed. And so we say that to any company, whether they are operating in the US, in China, or in any state.
Dan, I mean, if you look at China itself, It's run by Chairman Xi Jinping. The Communist Party has the overall say of all the matters related to the lives of the Chinese people. There's no track record of vibrant, multi-pluralist democracy. So ultimately, by the end of the day, this is going to be a decision made by the Communist Party, and they could use this as an excuse to further advance their agenda or prosecute their opponents. And we've seen many cases about people who have been targeted by this particular law. So why would people say, well, you know what, you have to give credit to the Chinese because they are trying to restructure their own economy?
Well, people have rights to get concerned over the system, and I personally do think there is some kind of Chineseness to establishing the social credit system by the Chinese government, because for hundreds, thousands of years, Chinese officials have been stressing the responsibility rather than accountability. And there are calls from the common public for a system that could punish petty crimes that are really hard to be caught by the law enforcement. And the government responded by this speedy setup of this digital solution. And that's definitely not a bad solution. I'm in no way to argue that it's not in violation of many of human rights. But the thing is, because it's not, no one is held accountable when bad things happen, but the government still thinks it has fulfilled some sort of responsibility and answered people's call. So this is in a way a justification for Chinese government, and I can see they want to do this.
Mr. Kapron, it doesn't seem that international or key players will be able to put any pressure on the Chinese government. If you remember the case of the Civil Aviation Authority asking companies when flying bound to China never to mention Taiwan as being an independent state, as part of the Chinese Republic. And everyone caved in ultimately because of the financial clout of China itself. Doesn't this look like a lost battle?
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge, and that's something that Air New Zealand flight a couple of weeks ago learned to its dismay when it had to turn back and not land in China. I think ultimately it's economic power and the economic heft of China. There are very few countries around the world that can stand up to the might of China. I mean, we're starting to see the U.S., obviously, with the Trump administration pushing on the trade, but we'll see how that ends up. We've seen the EU, Germany in particular, has been pressuring China for opening up the financial system. But at the end of the day, it's a good point. I mean, what can you do to pressure the Chinese government to act and behave in these ways? When you have things like the Belt and Road Initiative that have billions of dollars that are going to Africa and countries in Southeast Asia that leave these countries beholden to the Chinese government. How can you, when you have even the U.S., I mean, the Chinese government being the largest purchaser of treasury bills, how do you fight effectively that economic heft that China has?
Anna, let's look at the bigger picture and try to give credit, if there's any, to the Chinese government about this particular measure introduced. Don't you think that from now onwards, at least as far as we are concerned, as far as the Chinese are concerned, as far as the international customers are concerned, they will detect any company involved in tampering with its food items like baby powder milk? We know those who are going to mess up with the components of their pharmaceutical products, and it would be easy for international judiciary system to track them down.
I mean, I think, you know, we've got to separate kind of food standards or other sector or trade standards from human rights here. I think that we have to set this in a context of mass human rights violations. And again, just come back to that point that the state authorities are monitoring citizens as well as companies, sure. But those companies, you know, there are other ways to assess for transparency in their own operations.
Dan, let's go back to the idea of the social credit system, which is definitely going to be based on the technological advances when it comes to artificial intelligence, facial recognition, body scanning, geo-tracking, which will be used to monitor the shopping behaviors or the behaviors of every single Chinese in the near future. Aren't we getting into a dark territory here?
Well, this is not a China-only phenomenon, I have to say. There are companies in the US, in Europe, already starting to use this sort of technology to track their employees, like how much time they spend on each website and their hand movement, just to show how hard they work. And for China, of course, with its problematic record of the government, this is definitely a concern that it can misuse the data. It could do some harm, I believe, but for me, I do think overall it can actually bring, in certain aspect, a transparency to the law enforcement environment here. Because now everybody knows in China the legislation is basically too weak, and there's very little way that People's Congress can alter this law in a fundamental way. And in this transitional period, we need something alternative. We need something effective. And for Chinese government to do this, it runs a lot of risk. But I personally do hope that this kind of could be like other pilot experiment that Chinese government do, and eventually, if it doesn't work, then the government abandons it.
Mr. Kapron, Ms. Wang, she spoke about this as a global phenomenon. We should not really confine it to China. You've heard about the philosophers, the experts who've been saying over the last few years that if artificial intelligence is not really regulated, it could lead to the destruction of the Homo sapiens on Earth. Doesn't this pave the way for the need of a robust jurisdiction, new laws internationally to be able to say enough is enough?
Yeah, I fall asleep comfortably at night hoping that AI will not take over the world until after I'm gone. But certainly I think, a lot of these new technologies, and we haven't even touched on things like digital currency. I mean, digital currency in the minds of governments like in certain areas in Europe, these countries like Sweden that have gone largely digital. China is talking about having a completely digital currency, kind of similar to a Bitcoin, something that's based on the blockchain. The traceability of something like that really crosses all parts of our lives. We as society living in first-tier cities have smartphones, and just the amount of data that we're giving up to our telco providers, that we're giving up to Google and Apple. It's scary how much is revealed every week, it seems, about personal privacy. And so I think the idea of having personal privacy in the future is a little bit out the window. I'm curious to see how things like GDPR actually do protect the citizens in places like Europe. But I think it's a huge challenge.
Anna, we've been told for many years that digital age is going to bring about prosperity, health, happiness and equality for people all over the world. But it seems that we are veering towards something new, something called digital dictatorship.
I mean, we're very concerned at Amnesty about the human rights implications of AI, of machine learning technologies. We've seen in particular that machine learning technologies can really sort of allow states and companies as well to discriminate, particularly against minority groups at scale and at speed. So, again, look to the facial recognition systems across Xinjiang, which, the companies are now selling to, as your colleague mentioned, the Zimbabwean government, amongst other African states. So that technology can really, move at speed and has the propensity to violate the human rights of millions very quickly.
The Chinese government hopes to fully implement this law by the social credits program by 2020, when he hopes it becomes mandatory, and will definitely revisit this particular issue in the coming episodes of Inside Story. Dan Wang, Zennon Kapron, and Anna Bacchiarelli, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.